Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2025 New York City mayoral race, and we'll be focusing on the Democratic primary. I've got a lot to cover today. We're going to be talking about the candidates, what is at stake, what this all means, and of course I'll be offering some predictions at the end. One note before we get into today's video, I'm away from where I normally record. For that reason, the microphone quality might be a bit poor. My apologies in advance. I hope it isn't too bad. Now, let's get this started. Let's talk with the candidates, right? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about who these candidates are. But before we do any of those things, I want to start by talking about who the candidate for the Democratic Party is not. And that, of course, is Eric Adams, who was the nominee last time and is obviously the current mayor of New York City. Now, Eric Adams obviously is a Democrat, and he ran and won in 2021 as a Democrat, but he, upon becoming pretty scandal-plagued and actually widely somewhat unpopular, he really, I would say, recognized correctly, actually, that he would not win a Democratic primary and has instead switched to being an independent candidate. So he will be running for mayor of New York, and he'll be on the ballot come November, but he will not be the Democratic nominee. So that leaves a pretty open field, and I want to talk about a couple candidates. So the first one I want to talk about is Adrienne Adams. Now, Adrienne Adams is the current speaker of the New York City Council. I'd say she's probably a more progressive Democrat, not to the extent of Mamdani or even Brad Lander, but I'd say she's on the more progressive wing. But she's definitely, I don't want to say establishment because I think that word kind of gets like twisted to have a negative connotation. But she's been around for a little bit in New York City. She's well known by the Democratic Party, and I think she has support not really from moderates, but from kind of liberal Democrats and progressive Democrats. Michael Blake is a more progressive candidate. He is polling below Adams. Adams could really be, third place realistically on a or maybe third or fourth place, depending on how she does. Michael Blake is not polling that well. We'll go back to Andrew Cuomo. Brad Lander, who has kind of emerged as a respectable third place candidate, kind of leading the pack behind the big two, Mamdani and Cuomo, who we'll get into at the end. He's the current comptroller of New York City, and he is definitely a progressive, right? Like, he is someone who, has had a pretty progressive record, and some of his policies have actually been somewhat unpopular, right? Like, he's been criticized for opposing higher level classes in New York City public schools. So he's been a pretty staunch progressive, from the party since he's been elected comptroller, and he also was in the legislature. He was a former city council member as well, actually, as you can see right here. So Lander, definitely a more progressive option, maybe a bit to the right of Mamdani, but not by a lot. Zelnor Myrie, I think Zelnor Myrie is kind of, one of the closest to being a kind of like a normal, generic liberal, not super progressive, but not super moderate Democrat. He's focused a lot on issues such as housing. He's a state senator, so he has a decent platform, but he hasn't gained a lot of traction in this race. I'm going to skip Jessica Ramos. We'll talk about Scott Stringer and Whitney Tilson before we go to the main two. Scott Stringer is a former comptroller. He ran for mayor last time. I think he got 5th or 6th place. He's had a couple of scandals that have really harmed him. That being said, he's done okay. I think he's done. He's been a pretty consistent polling. He could be a 5th or 6th place candidate yet again. I don't really think he's super progressive, but he's definitely less moderate. I think he's kind of similar to Myrie in the sense that he's a pretty typical Democrat. Maybe he's similar to Adrienne Adams. Maybe he's a bit to the left of the party, but not by much. And Whitney Tilson is the one of the more moderate candidates in this race. Obviously, he's a businessman. He kind of. He harped on the fact the New York Times called him kind of like the heir to Cuomo, to Bloomberg, who obviously was a very moderate mayor. Tilson's polling 1%, though. He's not very viable right now. So the race is coming down essentially to two candidates, and that is former Governor Andrew Cuomo and, surprisingly, Assembly member Zohran Mamdani. Now, let's talk a little bit about these two candidates. Cuomo, again, former governor. He's also the former attorney general. He's been in New York politics as a Democrat for a while. I'd say he's objectively a controversial figure. A lot of people really like him. A lot of people also really don't like him. He's had a number of scandals, especially relating to sexual misconduct allegations, as well as his handling of the COVID pandemic in New York, where he forced elderly people into nursing homes. And this actually resulted, according to many, in unnecessary deaths, which is obviously a tragedy. That being said, a lot of people who support Cuomo, praise his leadership ability and his experience, and that's kind of been a broad theme of this campaign. Now, on the contrary, we've got Zohran Mamdani, who's a young assembly member who's only been in the legislature for 4 years, and he actually he doesn't have a huge track record in the legislature. And I don't say that to be critical. I'm stating a fact here, right? But he's definitely the more progressive candidate. He's actually a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He was a big Bernie Sanders. He was very progressive in 2016, 2020. He's got that definitely in his track record, and he's running. He really gained a lot of traction because he ran on freezing the rent. He's saying, "Look, we can freeze the rent. I believe we can do it." He wants to make public transportation free. Definitely the progressive favorite in this race. Him and Lander are the two main progressive candidates, and Lander's done okay, but Mamdani has been kind of the progressive darling of the race. So, with that being said, let's talk a little. Now that we kind of know the candidates, just to kind of talk about the polls a little bit, so we can kind of orient ourselves and see what matters, right? As we can see in the first round, Andrew Cuomo maintains a lead, and he's led the whole time since he's gotten the race. That's mostly because of name recognition, right? Like the average New Yorker 6 months ago probably didn't know who many of these people were. They probably knew Eric Adams. They probably knew Andrew Cuomo. Maybe one or two. Maybe they knew Brad Lander or Scott Stringer, right? But overall, this is certainly starting out with this big of a lead is just a product of name recognition. But Zohran Mamdani, who was at one point polling in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, he was in 6th place at one point, right? He surged to a pretty clear second. This is essentially a two-way race. And we actually got a poll from Emerson earlier today that actually showed him, or yesterday, that showed him up by 4% in the final round of ranked choice voting. He would be up 52 to 48 in the final round. So it's been, objectively, Mamdani's run a very good campaign. He's energized a lot of people. And we'll talk about that when I talk about my prediction, but he is really he has the momentum in this race, and I think that's clear, and I think everybody recognizes that he has the momentum in this race. And so that's pretty clear in these polls. Since May, he's shot up. He's gone from 20% to well over 30%, and he started at 4%, 5%. So it's been a good campaign for him. In third place, we do have Brad Lander. It's a distant third. He's polling around 10% right now. And, Brad Lander, I think he's run a solid campaign. I'll talk a little bit about what he's done when I talk more about Mamdani in a second here. But broadly, he's kind of been, another progressive. He has a more of a track record than Mamdani for sure, in terms of, I would say executive or legislative achievements. But his thing has really been, more like a more pragmatic brand of progressivism. Although, again, as I'm kind of teasing here, he has worked with Mamdani. They cross-endorsed. This is a ranked choice voting election, which means that you can have, looking at your ballot, you can rank up to 5 candidates. You can say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice, right? Like a great analogy would be like fast food restaurants, right? Like, say you're voting for which fast food restaurant you want to be the president, right? Like, maybe you might put, I don't know, I'd say my number one might be like In-N-Out Burger at the number one, right? But say, even though I like In-N-Out Burger, I also like, Wendy's, and I put Wendy's at the 2, right? And then if I'm insane, I put Burger King at the 3, which is just a joke. I don't like Burger King, but you're not insane if you do like it. I know a lot of people that do. But that kind of goes to show, like, it's a very, for Americans, it's not very conventional, but it's pretty simple. You just rank your candidates. And so Brad Lander and Zohran Mamdani, but a week and a half ago, came out and said, hey, look, we're cross-endorsing, so rank us 1 and 2. Brad Lander wants you to rank him 1 and Zohran Mamdani 2. Zohran Mamdani wants you to rank him 1 and rank Brad Lander 2. And so that's, I think that's kind of helping both of them. And really, the goal is to stop Andrew Cuomo. And then, just to kind of go over this, in 4th and 5th, obviously, we have Adrienne Adams, who I mentioned, is polling closer to Brad Lander. Maybe on a good night for her, she'll get 3rd place, but realistically not too much beyond that. She's, still clearly in 4th in most polling. And then in 5th place, and it's a distant 5th, is Scott Stringer, who, clearly has, he's run for mayor twice. He has, more name recognition than I would say Zohran Mamdani started with. As you can see, he led it. He was, in 2nd place in the polls for a little bit. But I think he's run a pretty bland campaign. I think it's been fine, but it hasn't been, good enough to propel him into a race with Cuomo, which, Mamdani has done. So now, before I offer prediction, what I do want to do is talk a little bit about why this race is close, right? New York, the Democratic electorate in New York is not, I don't believe, to be particularly progressive. And if you look at 2021, where we got nearly just under 1 million votes cast, I think you get a pretty good representation of this, right? Maya Wiley was probably the more progressive candidate in that race. I'd say Kathy Garcia was probably like the more traditional, Democrat. I'm not moderate, but I'm also not super progressive. I'm kind of working with both sides. And Eric Adams is the more moderate candidate, and he ran a more moderate campaign. And Eric Adams, even though I thought he actually ran, people don't talk about this, but I thought Eric Adams actually did not run that great of a campaign in 2021. He was able to win. First of all, he finished a full 9% ahead of the next closest person, but he was actually able to win after all the ranked choice voting stuff was tabulated. And he did that because he had the broadest coalition. So you can see, this is the Bronx up here. He did really well in the Bronx, did well in South Brooklyn, right, in these more working class neighborhoods. He did very well in Black and Hispanic, precincts, and he also did quite well in Queens. Now, Kathy Garcia, or excuse me, not Kathy Garcia, Maya Wiley, who's a more progressive candidate, she did well in North Brooklyn, right, like in these neighborhoods up here, and she also, was able to make some inroads in, parts of Manhattan, especially the more white parts of Manhattan, right. I don't want to go too granular. I don't want to get into the specific neighborhoods because I think you're kind of, it gets a little too much at a certain point. But I think, as you can see, right, like across the wider parts of Manhattan and in the more affluent parts, she did quite well. But broadly, Manhattan, as well as parts of, as essentially the more affluent parts of, kind of going out here to the western part of Brooklyn, Kathy Garcia did quite well, which isn't surprising. But again, like Eric Adams, the broadest coalition here. And Staten Island, which doesn't cast, it's a more conservative area, doesn't cast a ton of votes in the Democratic primary, but, still there, Eric Adams did broadly quite well. I think he won the votes there. And Maya Wiley did not do well at all in Staten Island, which is ultimately why she actually got third place despite coming second in raw votes. So that being said, that's like my broad case for New York not being a super progressive Democratic electorate, right? Like this is a city that, in the past 20 years has voted, or not, in the past 30 years has voted for 2 Republican mayors, Giuliani and Bloomberg. Bill de Blasio is progressive, no doubt about it, but I think 2021 was kind of a return to form where New York definitely leans liberal, leans Democratic, but they don't love progressive politics. And I think if it was anyone other than Andrew Cuomo, who was well known and who had a name of that level of recognition, whether it's good or bad recognition, just recognition raw, right? This race would not be a race. Zohran Mamdani would have a 0% chance of being the next mayor of New York City. Instead, we have a competitive primary, and we have a competitive primary because Andrew Cuomo is controversial, and a lot of people do not feel comfortable voting for him. And so, what's kind of emerged in this race is that Mamdani has been able to do remarkably well with a number of demographics that, should be going for Cuomo. First of all, Mamdani, in the past, I think 3 polls I've read, is winning the male vote outright over Cuomo. Women have actually swung towards Cuomo a little bit, but he's winning Asian voters decisively per Emerson. He was up, I think, 60% nearly over Cuomo with Asian voters in that one poll, and he's been up by a bit less than the other ones. And really, Mamdani's best demographic is white voters, and it's probably white voters in Brooklyn and Manhattan, in the more affluent and young parts of this city. It isn't working class white voters, and it isn't, in Staten Island, and it isn't, older Hispanic voters in parts of Brooklyn or Queens. It's younger white voters and affluent white voters who are maybe 30 to 50 years old. And that's why this race is close. Now, Cuomo, for his part, he's going to do roughly as well as, maybe if even better than Adams in the Bronx, right? Like these areas, have huge Black and Hispanic populations, a bit less affluent, right? This is going to be big for Cuomo. But now we're getting into a problem for Cuomo, which is that Mamdani right now very likely has banked more votes. And if you're like me and on the East Coast right now, is almost uncomfortably hot. And that isn't good, right? Like to wait in line on the hot pavement of a corner of a street corner in the Bronx, when it's 98 degrees, not fun. And that's a problem for Andrew Cuomo because, these electorates I've been talking about, where Mamdani's doing better with white voters or Asian voters or younger voters or affluent voters. If you look at the assembly districts that have turned out the most right here, you can see it's a pretty clear trend. And the trend here are that these are mostly, especially in North Brooklyn, these are progressive Maya Wiley voting precincts, or assembly districts, rather. The highest turnout one is right here, which is, this is Wiley and Garcia territory, not really Adams or Cuomo territory. And then you look at, Manhattan, which has been, central Manhattan, pretty progressive or pretty liberal at least, which is good for Brad Lander or Zohran Mamdani. They're turning out too. And then you look, there's the least turnout. It's right here. It's in the Bronx. It's this area right here. It's literally this area right here, which was one of, if not the strongest areas for Eric Adams, likely one of the strongest areas for Andrew Cuomo. So Cuomo's going to need pretty high turnout on election day, or reasonably high turnout. I mean, not insane, but reasonably high turnout on election day to beat Mamdani. And it's definitely possible mathematically. The votes are there, but the weather is really just not good at all for Cuomo. And I think Cuomo has realized this in the final days because, he began pushing people to vote early, and then he began pushing for, people to, I think he's kind of tried to raise the stakes of the election too. So it's pretty clear, right, what's going to happen, right? Obviously, I think third place is going to go to Brad Lander. I think fourth place is going to go to Adrian Adams, and I think fifth place is going to go to Scott Stringer. Beyond that, it's going to be close between Blake Myrie and Whitney Tilson. But here's what I will say: I think Mamdani's going to do okay with ranked choice voting. I think most of Brad Lander's voters are going to go for him, somewhere on their ballot. Same with the Adrian Adams voters, but I think that'll be a bit closer. Scott Stringer is kind of a wild card. He's kind of not emerged, but he's kind of doing well with maybe more moderate or older white voters who don't like Cuomo, don't like the baggage, but don't want to vote for a self-professed democratic socialist in Zohran Mamdani. And so this will be another wild card. But then again, the voters for Whitney Tilson are probably going to go to Cuomo. So it'll be interesting. But I think the path for Mamdani is pretty simple. It's lower election day turnout, because right now it's clear that your voters have more or less turned out. We'll also see if election day is looking younger or whiter, right? If turnout is still high in Manhattan or in parts in the more progressive parts of Brooklyn, that could be another path for Mamdani. Then for Cuomo, you're looking at just high turnout, ideally from most of Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx, and that's what you're doing. But again, Brooklyn will be interesting, just in general, because it's big, it's more diverse. There's some parts of it that are going to be really good for Cuomo, some parts of it are going to be pro Mamdani. But this is going to be a very interesting race, and I'm honestly excited to see how it turns out. And again, prediction, I think it's a pure toss-up, but I am a big believer in momentum, so I don't hold this belief super I don't have a ton of confidence in this prediction. I think this is a really hard race to predict because it's a primary and it's ranked choice voting, and you have so many factors to consider, like the weather and whatnot, which is crazy. I think right now Mamdani has a very slight edge just because he's more votes banked and he has momentum, and I think that there's been a more tactical campaign to ask people to not so many candidates, whether it's him or Lander or I think Zellner Myrie, or even maybe, I might be wrong, but I think Adrian Adams too, have said don't rank Cuomo. And I think eventually that kind of cohesion makes it harder for Cuomo to win, because he's not going to get to 50% in the first ballot. He might get to 35 or 40. He's not going to get to 50. So he needs more people, who are voting for other candidates to rank him ahead of Zohran Mamdani. And at the end of the day, when you have a bunch of candidates endorsing against you and kind of getting behind Mamdani, who has the momentum late, it's hard. And you're also banking on a very, very hot and uncomfortable election day. So Cuomo can definitely win. He has more name recognition. He's kind of the favorite. I'd say conventionally. I think the not the media, because I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but the media or the pundits I think still favor him. But I think Mamdani is at least underrated right now. So for that reason, I'll pick him. With that being said, this is a close race. It's hard to predict. I don't have a ton of confidence in this prediction, and I would not be surprised at all if Cuomo wins. I think Cuomo has more upside than Mamdani, right? But at the end of the day, I think Mamdani's momentum is enough to maybe make him a narrow favorite, nothing more than like a 51-49 type of ranked choice voting victory. So let me know what you all think. Let me know what you're anticipating. And again, if you're in New York and you haven't voted already, first of all, vote early because it's easier, and you don't have to stand in the sweltering heat. But if you are a Democrat in New York, go vote and make your voice heard. So let me know what you want to see next, and I'll talk to you all later.